The 7 African powers, Orishas in America's hidden history, 7 divine forces crossed the ocean in secret, disguised as saints, waiting to be called by those who dared to remember their names. Long before their images appeared on prayer candles in corner stores from Miami to the Bronx, the Orishas traveled a path forged in survival and secrecy. The 7 African powers, 7 divine beings arranged in a constellation of sacred imagery, now visible in botánicas and spiritual shops across the United States, represents one of the most remarkable journeys of faith in the Western Hemisphere. This is not merely the story of how religious practices crossed borders. This is the documentation of how cosmic forces, disguised as Catholic saints during centuries of suppression, emerged into American consciousness, carrying the full weight of their original power. The visual language presents itself clearly to anyone who enters a botánica in New York's Washington Heights, Miami's Little Havana, or the Mission District of San Francisco. The prayer cards display 7 figures surrounding a central image, each deity rendered in specific colors with specific sacred symbols. Obatalá appears in white, the father of creation and embodiment of wisdom. Yemayá manifests in blue, the ocean mother whose depths contain all possibility. Ogún flows in yellow and gold, the river goddess who governs love and prosperity. Shango strikes in red and white, the thunder king whose justice arrives with the force of lightning. Ogún stands in green and black, the iron warrior who clears paths and protects laborers. Eleguá opens doorways in red and black, the trickster child who controls all crossroads and communication. Orishas witnesses in green and yellow, the divine oracle who knows all destinies. These are not abstract concepts or poetic metaphors. Within the tradition of Santeria, also known as Lukumi or Regla de Ocha, these beings possess agency, personality, preferences, and power. They accept offerings, answer prayers, intervene in human affairs, and demand proper respect. The tradition itself emerged from the forced diaspora of Yoruba peoples from West Africa to Cuba during the transatlantic enslavement period, carrying their spiritual cosmology across the Middle Passage in the only vessels that could not be confiscated. Human memory, the survival strategy developed through desperate ingenuity. When Spanish colonial authorities and the Catholic Church prohibited open Orisha worship, practitioners recognized correspondences between their deities and Catholic saints. Obatalá became associated with Our Lady of Mercy, both robed in white and emanating peace. Yemayá merged with Our Lady of Regla, the Black Madonna venerated in Havana Bay. Ogún aligned with Our Lady of Charity, Cuba's patron saint, both dressed in yellow and associated with rivers and sweet waters. Shango synchronized with Saint Barbara, the Catholic martyr depicted in red and white, associated with thunderstorms. Ogún corresponded to Saint Peter, the keeper of keys and symbol of foundational strength. Eleguá took the form of the Holy Child of Atocha or Saint Anthony, both childlike figures associated with journeys and miracles. This syncretism functioned as spiritual camouflage. Practitioners could maintain altars that appeared Catholic to colonial authorities while simultaneously honoring the Orishas through their saintly disguises. The strategy succeeded beyond mere survival. It created a rich hybrid visual and ritual culture that preserved the essential cosmology while incorporating new symbolic elements. The colors remained precise. The sacred numbers 7 for Yemayá, 5 for Ogún, 4 for Shango continued their significance. The ritual foods specific to each Orisha, white foods for Obatalá, honey for Ogún, rum and palm oil for Shango, maintained their traditional preparation. This living tradition remained concentrated in Cuba through the 19th and early 20th centuries, practiced within Afro-Cuban communities, and transmitted through oral tradition and ritual initiation. The documentation of these practices became possible through the extraordinary work of Lidia Cabrera, a Cuban ethnographer who dedicated decades to recording the complexity of Afro-Cuban religious traditions. Born into Havana's white elite in 1899, Cabrera developed a profound respect for Afro-Cuban culture, that placed her outside the racial and class prejudices of her background. Her masterwork, El Monte, The Forest, published in 1954, stands as the most comprehensive documentation of Santeria cosmology and practice ever produced. The volume records the attributes of each Orisha with meticulous precision, the specific herbs sacred to each deity, the myths explaining their domains and personalities, the ritual protocols for approaching them, the divinatory systems through which they communicate. Cabrera compiled this knowledge through decades of participant observation, earning the trust of practitioners who recognized her genuine dedication to understanding and preserving their tradition. The 1959 Cuban Revolution fundamentally altered this landscape. The Castro government's officially atheist ideology suppressed religious practice generally, but Afro-Cuban traditions faced particular scrutiny and restriction. This suppression drove waves of Cuban migration to the United States, particularly to Miami, which became the primary receiving point for Cuban exiles. These migrants carried their spiritual traditions with them, establishing Santeria communities in Miami, New York, Newark, and other cities with significant Cuban populations. The tradition's arrival in the United States occurred quietly, practiced within Cuban immigrant households and community networks. But by the 1970s, the first botánicas, spiritual supply shops stocking the materials required for Orisha worship, appeared in neighborhoods with Cuban and Puerto Rican populations. These shops carried the beaded necklaces called Eleguá in the specific color patterns of each Orisha, the ceramic soup tureens that serve as vessels for Orisha stones, the specific herbs and roots required for ritual baths and offerings, and the 7 African powers imagery that would become the tradition's most recognizable symbol in the broader American market. The 7 African powers prayer cards and candles represented an innovation of the Diaspora, a consolidation of the most widely venerated Orishas into a single devotional image. While traditional practice involves developing specific relationships with individual Orishas through divination and initiation, the 7 African powers concept offered a way for practitioners to invoke the full spectrum of divine assistance without requiring extensive ritual knowledge. This accessibility drove its spread beyond the boundaries of formal Santeria communities. By the 1980s and 90s, 7 African powers materials appeared in ordinary grocery stores in Latino neighborhoods, purchased by people with varying levels of knowledge about their origins and proper use. Academic researchers documenting Santeria in the United States during this period recorded the phenomenon of what they termed popular Santeria, engagement with Orisha imagery and concepts by individuals outside formal initiated practice. Prayer candles bearing the 7 African powers image became as common in certain neighborhoods as Catholic devotional candles, their presence so normalized that many purchasers understood them simply as powerful spiritual tools without necessarily knowing the specific cosmology they represented. This diffusion created what experienced practitioners describe as a spiritually hazardous situation. The Orishas, according to tradition, respond to whoever calls them, regardless of that person's level of knowledge or preparation. Documented cases from New York and Miami Santeria communities in the 80s and 90s describe individuals who purchased 7 African powers materials, performed improvised rituals based on intuition or incomplete information, and subsequently experienced what priests diagnosed as chaotic spiritual disruption. These disruptions manifested as persistent nightmares, relationship breakdowns, financial disasters, and patterns of misfortune that divination identified as the consequence of attracting Orisha attention without establishing proper relationship. The traditional response to such situations follows a specific protocol. The affected individual consults an experienced Babalawo, a priest of Ifa divination, or an Olorisha, a general Santeria priest. The practitioner performs divination using either the Ifa chain of opal or the Dilagun cowrie shells to identify which Orisha has taken interest, and what that deity requires. The prescription typically involves specific offerings, foods, liquids, ritual objects presented according to precise protocols, and may ultimately require initiation into formal practice through ceremonies ranging from receiving elects to full initiation as a priest oneself. Numerous personal narratives from American Santeria practitioners describe this exact trajectory. They purchased a 7 African Powers candle during a moment of crisis, prayed with sincere desperation, received what seemed like miraculous intervention, and then found themselves caught in escalating spiritual turbulence that only resolved through formal engagement with the tradition. The experience, described from within the tradition's framework, represents not punishment but invitation. The Orisha noticed the person and calls for proper relationship. Lydia Cabrera, forced into exile in Miami by the revolution that suppressed the traditions she had documented, witnessed this transformation from her position in the diaspora. Until her passing in 1991, she continued documenting Afro-Cuban religious practice as it adapted to its new context, observing how the traditions she had recorded in Cuba transformed in their encounter with American pluralism and consumer culture. Her documentation preserved the baseline of traditional Cuban practice against which these American innovations could be measured. The scholarly study of Santeria in the United States expanded significantly in the 1980s and 90s as researchers documented the religion's spread and transformation. Anthropologists recorded the emergence of non-Cuban practitioners, Puerto Ricans, African Americans, and even Anglo-Americans, seeking initiation into a tradition that had historically been ethnically bounded. These new practitioners brought different cultural frameworks and spiritual needs to a tradition that proved remarkably adaptable while maintaining its core cosmological structure. The legal status of Santeria practice in the United States reached the Supreme Court in 1993 in the case Church of the Lukumi Babalu IV City of Hialeah, when a Florida city attempted to ban animal offerings central to Santeria practice. The court ruled unanimously that such bans violated religious freedom, establishing legal protection for practices that many Americans found unfamiliar or disturbing. This legal recognition marked a watershed in the tradition's American history, affirming its status as a legitimate religious practice protected by constitutional guarantees. The presence of botánicas in American cities now functions as a visible marker of spiritual diversity. These shops, stocking materials for Santeria, Espiritismo, Hoodoo, and various other spiritual traditions, create commercial spaces where African diaspora religions interface with the broader public. The 7 African Powers imagery remains among their most popular items, purchased by initiated practitioners maintaining formal altars, by spiritual seekers from various backgrounds experimenting with different traditions, and by people with no specific religious commitment who simply sense power in the images and hope for assistance. This democratization of access troubles some within the formal tradition. The concern centers on respect and proper knowledge. The Orishas, according to traditional teaching, possess immense power and specific preferences. Approaching them without proper knowledge risks not only spiritual ineffectiveness, but actual harm. Yet the tradition also recognizes that the Orishas themselves choose their devotees, often through exactly the kind of unexpected encounter that a prayer candle purchased on impulse might represent. The academic study of this phenomenon explores questions of religious authority, cultural appropriation, and spiritual authenticity. Who has the right to engage with these traditions? What constitutes proper practice? How do living traditions maintain coherence while adapting to new cultural contexts? The answers remain contested, negotiated in ongoing conversations within practitioner communities and between traditional authorities and newer initiates. The 7 African Powers journey from Cuban syncretic innovation to ubiquitous American spiritual symbol demonstrates religion's capacity for transformation and transmission. The same beings who survived the Middle Passage disguised as Catholic saints, now appear on candles in convenience stores, their images and names circulating through populations far removed from their Yoruba origins or Cuban developments. Whether this represents the tradition's triumph or its dilution depends on perspective and framework. What remains consistent across interpretations is the recognition of genuine power. Even scholars approaching Santeria from secular academic perspectives document practitioners' reports of dramatic interventions, illnesses healed, jobs obtained, relationships restored, attributed to Orisha assistance. Whether these outcomes result from divine intervention, psychological transformation, or coincidence matters less within the tradition than the experiential reality that calling upon the Orishas produces results. The tradition's cosmology contains no concept of faith separate from experience. The Orishas prove themselves through action or they do not. This pragmatic approach to spiritual practice appeals particularly to practitioners seeking tangible assistance with concrete problems rather than abstract theological satisfaction. The 7 African powers represent comprehensive coverage: wisdom, protection, prosperity, love, justice, opportunity, guidance. The full range of human need addressed through specific divine personalities with documented preferences and proven effectiveness. Contemporary Santeria in the United States continues evolving while maintaining connection to its Cuban roots and Yoruba foundations. Practitioners travel to Cuba for initiation ceremonies, maintaining lineages and relationships with elder priests. They travel to Nigeria seeking connection with Yoruba traditional practice, exploring the African origins of their diaspora tradition. They establish houses and lineages in American cities, creating new centers of authority and innovation. The 7 African powers imagery continues circulating, visible in neighborhoods across America, recognized even by people who could not name the individual Orishas or explain their domains. This visibility marks something unprecedented in the tradition's history: public presence in a society with constitutional religious freedom, commercial availability in an open market, legal protection from suppression. The journey from survival through concealment to thriving through visibility represents a transformation as dramatic as the Middle Passage itself, though moving in the opposite direction. The question that practitioners and scholars alike continue examining is what happens when traditions rooted in specific cultural contexts and requiring specific knowledge circulate freely through populations lacking that context and knowledge. The 7 African powers candle, purchased by someone with no connection to Yoruba tradition, Cuban culture, or Santeria initiation, still bears the names and images of beings whose power, according to tradition, remains real and active. The call goes out regardless of the caller's qualifications. The Orishas, tradition teaches, respond according to their own judgment. If you found this case compelling, subscribe to Vanishing Roads for more documented paranormal investigations from around the world. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented case files. All events reference real investigations and reported incidents.